After a run of rather unusual releases, in terms of their format at least, with tracks released over different formats in different running orders, 2016 seemed to be a year that ever so well was being slightly more experimental with the way they were putting music out again. However, by the end of the year, it was time for the 6th volume of the Environment series to come out. For several years now, these have contained nothing but entirely new material, so the general consensus was that this was going to be a conventional album. And then the band went and did things incredibly differently, by releasing Environment 6 and Environment 6.5, both of which we'll be looking at today on Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Release date 6th of October 2016. Environment 6 was first announced in June 2014, 3 months before the release of Environment 5. By this point, this kind of thing was taken for granted, especially given the numerical series. Actually, with 5 being an album of completely new recordings, there was a feeling that maybe it was time for a new album away from the series, which itself was hinted at further by Gaz's 2015 comment that a new FSOL album is beginning to be very much an exciting proposition again. Still, by this point, the 6th volume of the Environment series had been announced, and for the most part, fans generally expected it to be the next album of new material. This wasn't originally the case. There was talk of the 6th volume being completed by late 2014, with a 2015 release planned. Environment 5 was briefly hoped to be a double album based around rumours, so expectations for 6 were built around being the second disc of that. The appearance of Life in Moments, informally referred to as Environment 5.5 by some fans, still the original Environment 6, or Environments 6, according to the Artworks 1 booklet, was completed much earlier than the final album. Brian described it to me as being more of a drifting ambient record, and a return to the mixture of new and archive material approach of past Environments, which was very good in its own right, but after the very bold sound and huge popularity of Environment 5, he decided the album needed to be bigger and better, and so this early version was scrapped. Elements of it appeared on archived Environmental Views in 2017. And so time passed, and it was more than 2 years after Environment 5 that the 6th volume finally arrived. Having not spoken about FSOL for quite a few months, it was a surprise to hear Gaz mention in June 2016 that Environment 6 was imminent. After a little speculation, it was revealed that the album would have an October release date, and one track would be called I Dream in Viral Blue. At the end of September, a teaser trailer, in proper movie style, was added to YouTube. And then 6 days later, it was announced that both Environment 6 and Environment 6.5 were to be released within 24 hours. This oddly unexpected reveal mirrored the joyous release of Environments 2, not from the Archives Volume 5 on the same day, completely out of the blue, 8 years before. This is where the story splits in two, because Environment 6 and Environment 6.5 are very much different albums despite their combined release. Environment 6 was promoted on YouTube with a clip of Yut Moik, with a fast-paced video featuring gear from Brian's studio. If someone had followed the Environment series and maybe Life in Moments without hearing albums like Four Forests, Archived 8, Ignition of the Sun and Black Hill Transmitter, Environment 6 would probably come as a massive shock to them. Instead of a continuation of the organic guitar and piano-led music of the previous few records, Environment 6 leads very heavily into the darker, more minimal electronic work of some of the FSOL Digital era side projects, with a mixture of analog electronics and IDM glitches, combining with moments of brooding ambience, tribal percussion and field recordings. If anything, it feels much closer to the Electric Brainstorm series of mixes than any past FSOL album, and it's clearly inspired by Brian's time spent in a church in the middle of a forest on the convergence of 9 ley lines in the broadly spooky-feeling West Country of the UK. It's an eerily rural, rustic album with strong hauntology influences. It's by far the most electronic-oriented FSOL album since Dead Cities at least. If one was to view the band's catalogue in a very literally chronological manner, it could be perceived that the more electronic technoid approach to Archived 8 fed into the new sound of this album. The sound was also foreshadowed by the compilation track Obelisk heard earlier in the year. This new sound was partly a response to the more amorphous-leaning approach of the previous few FSOL records. With the sessions for the next Amorphous album in full flow at this point, FSOL shifted back into pure electronica. Also, with the SX1 and the Halia synths being developed by FSOL and Digitana at this point, it was an opportunity to showcase their range of sounds, and they both feature heavily, also helping dictate the style of music. As with 6.5, the album was largely recorded in early 2016, although Forest Soundbed first appeared on Electric Brainstorms Volume 7 under the name The Trees from a forthcoming album called Views at that point. The album is, to the best of my knowledge, the first FSOL record to feature no vocal samples in any form whatsoever. Perhaps the biggest difference between this and previous records is the structure. Every single between-track environment and linking section here has its own index and title. This process had begun with environments 3 and 4, with some of their short environment tracks having their own index on those albums, and it was hinted at with the titles appearing in the graph on the artwork for Tales of Ephedrina, but here it's taken to its logical extreme, resulting in 23 tracks. It's possible to create a similar tracklist for previous albums. Dead Cities can be split into 22 tracks, should one really wish it so, making this no different listening-wise, but it does mean the tracklist is a bit of a headfuck. This is basically the point where my previously almost flawless knowledge of every track name on the band's main albums gives up the ghost, and I can only remember maybe half the titles here at any particular time. This decision to include everything as individual tracks came partly from a desire to play around with structure, also niggling those fans like myself who enjoy things being neat and tidy over the run of a whole series. It was partly inspired by early punk bands often writing minute-long songs. Given the length of the record and the louder, deeper sound than some of the earlier volumes in the series, the final edition is edited to include fewer tracks. Despite the general success of FSOL Digital, it's still a tiny label, and undoubtedly pressing double albums is a vast expense. The LP version does, however, include a bonus track entitled Silent Around Them. An alternate mix of this would be released on archived environmental views as Silence in Her Eyes. The running order is also edited a little, with some tracks from near the end of the CD edition placed much earlier in the LP's running order. The artwork for Environment 6 has always felt very slightly underwhelming to me. Given the exceptionally evocative atmosphere of the album, having some walked photos of walkways in London's Elephant and Castle doesn't really seem fitting. Several of Boogie's photos are used and manipulated by Brian, and the shots clearly date to the same photo shoot as the Podroom's ISDN transmission covers. The back cover features a more impressive composite shot of the walkway combined with a tree photograph, the latter overlaid with the FSOL Digital standard water damage splatter effect. The overall structuring and layout is credited to Yage, evidencing that Boogie's involvement was very little at this point, simply having provided the original photos. The back cover and CD booklet back feature the Herd Killing, Curves and EBV logos. The CD itself includes the three, plus the linked Squares Environments emblem. The credits page includes the same three, plus a very small version of the Splatter logo. The booklet features text about the creation of the track Wild Weather, the first time an individual piece has been mentioned in such a way on an FSOL album credit section since the 1990s. The credits make no mention of either members' names, reverting simply to FSOL. For the first time, gear is mentioned in the general credits, with the appearance of EMS instruments on an FSOL release, as well as Skyflow synths by FSOL Digitana, something that would be explained further in forthcoming years. Some found the more amorphous-leaning approach of previous environments unappealing. With Environment 6, this was no longer a concern. It was also the point where long-term fans, including myself, realised that for the foreseeable future, any new album that came along would be labelled an environment. Polarise. From a chronological perspective, Environment 6 begins with a huge surprise. Clattering electronic drums fade in gradually, followed by a huge, dark synth melody. After a few years of moving towards a more acoustic-based sound with guitars, pianos, live drums appearing regularly, this dramatic shift towards dark, heavy electronica feels very bizarre. Still, it kicks off the album on a high, with an excellent track in its own right and one that sets the tone for the rest of the record. The drums are constantly shifting with different patterns and elements introduced throughout, and synths are utilised in different manners. A light portamento melody, atmospheric pads, some loud fuzzy notes that cut through the whole track. The piece basically says, "Welcome, this is going to be a dark ride." Mountain Path. bells, running water, synth strings, a familiar guitar sound, and that title. Is this technically a remix of Mountain Goat? We know the track hadn't been recently recorded, so maybe it came about as part of that process. There may even have been a plan to do a Mountain Goat re-recorded album. Either way, it's a simply dreamy ambient sound with harp notes, synth squelches and field recordings adding to all the texture. It's an interesting contrast with the much harsher opening track, yet doesn't jar at all. The guitar and harp notes become subtly more intense as the piece goes on, reaching a gentle crescendo and fading away to an outro of reverse percussion and atmospheric synth notes. Thought Pattern. Thought Pattern opens with bleepy sounding synth arpeggios and melodies, playing a very melancholic tune. Choir-like pads join in and a glitchy mid-tempo IDM-esque beat is added, followed by plucked sounding synth notes. There are hints of some Dead Cities tracks. Antique Toy and Glass are loosely in the same area, but generally it doesn't really sound like past FSOL at all, not even Environments 1 to 5 era. Earlier in the year, Obelisk had been heard, and is the only track that really hints at this particular sound. If, like me, you're a fan of emotive minor key stuff, this will go down incredibly well, and even if all the sounds are synthesised without a hint of the band's classic sample-heavy approach, there's still enough detail and texture for it to all feel like FSOL. Motioned. Motion continues the alternating structure, moving back to a more acoustic approach after a synth-based track. Moody backing drones slide along behind wandering percussion, giving the impression of a slow procession heading through a wood. A huge array of drums, shakers, cymbals and bells are used, making the piece feel incredibly varied despite its rather limited approach. It could easily have come from a Black Hill Transmitter record or a Yage one, sharing those projects' instrumentation and bleak rural sound. Lycaon? I'm not sure what the title means. Is it a misspelling of lichen? But it's far from being the only FSOL track with a bizarre name. After a long intro featuring a simple bleeping sequence, synth notes and glitchy drums come in with a stylistic continuation of Thought Pattern. Once again, it's a sad, brooding melody leading the track, fed through delay units to give the piece a huge amount of space. As it reaches its final minute, new synth sequences and chords come in, lending a much brighter feel and ending the piece on a happier note. Forest Soundbed. Forest Soundbed first appeared 5 years prior to its release on Electric Brainstorms Volume 7. At the time it was labelled as The Trees and advertised to be from a forthcoming release called Views. It never turned up on Views the following year. The title is fitting, with field recordings of birdsong and wind in the trees, over which a heartbeat-like pulse plays, synth washes sweep, and white noise whooshes subtly creep up. It's incredibly abstract but hugely atmospheric and captures the album's dark woodland feel perfectly. Soul 7. Soul 7 continues with what is becoming a familiar sound on Environment 6 with mid-tempo, glitchy IDM-style beats and moody minor key synth passages. Here the melodies are less bleepy, instead creating a soft blanket of sound. Odd chirping notes do burst through, seemingly at random however, matching the clicking nature of the beats. There's subtle variation throughout the piece in terms of which synth lines are playing at any one time, but otherwise it's quite a static track, with a fairly minimal array of sounds and little progression. Thankfully this doesn't harm the mood created. track on Environment 6 to feel very much like an environment and nothing else. Hurt is a minute of whooshing sounds, processed field recordings, and a simple synth arpeggio which gets louder and louder before the whole thing stops and fades off into huge reverb trails. It definitely feels like it would have been the outro to Soul 7 had the album been more conventionally structured. Wild Weather. Wild Weather is the one concession to the band's modern classical side on Environment 6, albeit in a much weirder way than past forays into the sound. Interestingly, the liner notes describe the creation process. Track 9 is part of field recording notations. In this case, a metal gate was moved back and forth at different speeds, creating different tones and rhythms. This was then transcribed to a musical script for piano with string and bass accompaniment. In parts, the metal gate has been left in the recording. The unconventional manner of composition explains the thoroughly discordant cacophony that is the track. Atonal piano notes, sharp brass and string samples, screeching metal. It's a sinister and uncomfortable track. The trip through the wood is taking the listener to some bizarre and unfriendly places. No further tracks from field recording notations have been released in the decades since. Unclear Vape. Another return to the bleepy, glitchy ambient IDM side of Environment 6 here, with dark synth chords, fast trebly beats and minor key stabs. It develops quite a bit over the course of its short 2-minute runtime, with elements added all throughout. Despite the busy drum programming, it creates a fairly spacious atmosphere. Voyeur. Interestingly, reading back on my first thoughts of Environment 6, I noticed that Voyeur sounded quite a little bit like Z-Box. At the time I hadn't realised that it was indeed first broadcast on Electric Brainstorm 10 as a Z-Box track called Sewage Worker Triangle. Of course, it's not the first time a Z-Box track has ended up on an Ever So Well release, but given the album is broadly believed to consist of new recordings, it raises the question of whether this was intended to be new Z-Box material, or if it's an older unreleased recording recently enhanced. A noisy percussive loop runs throughout, with bizarre scraping noises and menacing synth drones over the top. At just over a minute, it feels very much like the closing environment to previous track Unclear Vape, taking us deeper into the haunted forest. Sec/-9. Part of the aim of this series is to try and make sense of the band's material, to take each track and put it into context of the group's history, the album's structure, and the potential creativity that went behind it. Very occasionally, something comes along that I can't make sense of, and Sec/-9 is one of these moments. Halfway through Environment 6, the brooding atmosphere stops for 28 seconds, while a bright analogue synth sequence plays 4 times, then abruptly stops. It baffled me in 2016, baffles me in 2025, it will no doubt continue to baffle me on my deathbed. Exerting force or influence. Another standalone environment on Environment 6, this middle run of tracks raised a little controversy at the time for maybe including too many environments in a short space of time. Brian spotted the comment on the Ever So Well board and retorted by asking me what people expected from an album called Environment 6. Touché. Exerting force or influence is a very abstract one, generally consisting of field recordings, rain, clattering metal, dripping water, and a handful of synth notes and effects. It always gives me the impression of standing in an echoey cave while it rains outside. With the final 20 seconds featuring a fade-in of the next track, one might imagine on a more conventionally structured album it would have acted as the opening environment for that piece. Symphony for Halia. Environment 6 isn't a very tracky album, with few absolute classics among its many pieces. Instead, it creates a very tactile atmosphere by stitching together electronic fragments with environments and brief acoustic moments into a very visceral soundscape. That said, there is one absolute standout on the record, and that is Symphony for Halia. Created only using one piece of equipment, the FSOL Digitana Halia synth, designed by the band and Digitana, due to be released to the market any decade now. It's a stunningly beautiful synth track with a haunting sequence running throughout, choral sounding pads and quiet glitchy rhythms. While ostensibly the same kind of piece as the other IDM-esque tracks on Environment 6, it stands out by the strength of its composition. It isn't just a piece to create atmosphere, it's a gorgeous standalone track in its own right, and an absolute career highlight. Imagined Friends. Another standalone environment opening with flute notes, with papery shaking sounds and bass notes following. The second half features the clocks environment also included on Newfoundland. On a more conventionally structured album, it would probably form the opening environment to the next track. Electric Pastoral. After 40 minutes of largely dark, brooding atmospherics, Electric Pastoral lightens the mood of Environment 6 dramatically with its fast tempo, airy synth pads and uplifting melodies. On first listen, I was pretty convinced this track came from the same early 90s sessions that led to pieces like Coastline and Crosswinds, so I was incredibly surprised when it turned out no archive material features on the album. A remarkable direction for FSOL to go in after so many years moving away from the early 90s. As ever, in 2 minutes it goes through several movements, with only the bass line remaining static throughout. Plausibility. Further tying the Environment series together, Plausibility opens with flutes first heard on Environments Part 1, before heading into darker territory once more. A quiet echoey rhythm hushes the piece forward, while acoustic bass notes pluck, lo-fi analog synths drone, and bizarre sounds are thrown around the mix. Acoustic drums threaten to burst through on a few occasions, but never quite make it, simply appearing as moments of texture. The flutes return for the close of this wonderfully eerie track. Yut Moik. Back to bleeping synths and complex IDM beats once again here. The tempo of Yut Moik is much faster than many of the similar pieces on the album, and the synths are programmed with more complexity, giving a dense, confusing vibe rather than one led by a catchy melody. The choice of synth sounds always makes me think of being underwater, or maybe even drowning. The track was created almost entirely using the Teenage Engineering OP1 synth. Beyond the field of vision. Where some tracks on Environment 6 feel like they could be opening or closing environments for other, longer, unrelated pieces, Beyond the Field of Vision sounds much more than that, utilising these same synth pads as Yut Moik, and thus feeling very much like the outro to the same piece. As an acoustic guitar loop appears, it's easy to compare it to the environment that closes Dead Skin Cells. The guitar, combined with flutes and background textures, brings the eerie, rustic feel of Environment 6 right to the foreground again. Leak Stereo 70. Well, that's a weird title, apparently named after a 1970s amplifier. The longest track on Environment 6 is also the darkest and most oppressive sounding. Having spent the last 45 minutes tracing our way through a gloomy forest, what do we find at the heart? chugging electronic beats, deep sub-bass and layers of sharp, discordant drones gradually building over the space of 4 minutes. A harrowingly intense piece that requires a very particular mood to appreciate it, but an astonishing piece of sound design and creativity at the same time. The track was run into the red, giving it a thick, compressed sound, and was apparently inspired by Holland Tunnel Dive by Implog, a piece which had featured on Electric Brainstorm 3. Pipe Dream. After the intense crescendo of Leak's Stereo 70, Environment 6 slows its pace for a more peaceful coda, starting with Pipe Dream. It opens with vinyl crackle, over which warm analog synth notes and chords play. Reverse guitars reverberate in the background, and a slow, jazzy acoustic drumline comes in for the final 30 seconds, leading into the track's partner piece, Meanders. On a more conventionally structured FSOL album, one imagines the two would simply have been one piece. Meanders. Effectively the second half of Pipe Dream, picking up that track's jazzy drums and warm synths, while a field recording of a children's playground chimes through in the background. After a long trawl through a dark forest environment, this is the point where normality is within our grasp once more. A beautiful synth melody appears in the final 30 seconds, bringing the track to a close. The drums were recorded by Brian in Glasgow from a long and now sadly lost recording of a street drummer. Solace. Solace closes the album on possibly its brightest moment. Birdsong and sheep bars run throughout, the journey having come out of the dark woodland into the brightness of the open countryside. Beautiful major key synth pads draw the ear and welcome the listener back into the daylight. A lo-fi drum machine sets the pace of the final steps of our journey. The 303 line goes its way into the mix, not a sound one normally associates with down-tempo ambient music, and a wonderfully strange contribution to the track. After such a dark album, it really feels like solace. Fuzzy synth chords play through the second half, and continually evolving beats eventually collapse into gentle glitches as the album comes to a close. Silent Around Them. Environment 6's vinyl exclusive track Silent Around Them sounds like little else on the album actually, with a glitchy granular texture and drones making it feel more like a Black Hill Transmitter track than one by FSOL. Behind the thick wall of ambience, occasional notes and sounds from the synthia are heard. An extended and further developed version of the piece appears on archived environmental views as Silence in Her Eyes. The Future Sound of London, Environment 6.5. Release date 6th of October 2016. I think the reveal of Environment 6, with the 6 spelled and the title in mixed case, and Environment 6.5, Environment in all caps and 6.5 as figures, released as partner albums at the same time, was the moment that I gave up on FSOL albums having any titular consistency. Honestly, expecting it is just inviting disappointment. And it's a good job because things would get far less concise from here on out. The 6.5 title basically suggests that this is another album recorded at the same time, but very much a different record, rather than this simply being a double album like Lifeforms. There are several ways of describing the differences between the two, but the most blatant is that 6.5 is much more overtly Gaz oriented. This is obvious from a glance at the tracklist, with titles like The Day the Poles Shifted and Hollow Earth. The general rule is if it sounds like a conspiracy theory, Gaz wrote it. Actually, the album is more consistently structured than 6, with a few recurring themes throughout. Solid Earth is reprised musically on The Day the Poles Shifted and thematically on Hollow Earth. Meanwhile, Anacro Rhythm continues the development of the instrumental psych tracks away from Amorphous and towards FSOL. Without any obvious guitar or flute solos, Anacro Rhythm has ended up as an FSOL track, despite being a stylistic cousin of something like Riders on Circadian Rhythm. As a fan, it's interesting to watch this back and forth between Brian and Gaz's two main projects, with pieces that, had they been completed in 2001, would clearly have been marked Amorphous tracks, now ending up on FSOL albums. One assumes that had Elysian Fields or Her Tongue is Like a Jellyfish been finished in 2016, they would have ended up on Environment 6 and 6.5. The jazzy I Dream in Viral Blue is a wonderful halfway house with the acoustic elements of Amorphous combined with FSOL abstraction and electronic production. It was offered as the first preview of the album. The structure of the album is much the same as Environment 6, with every opening or closing environment given its own index and title, leading once again to 23 individual tracks. I actually posited similar structures for the band's 90s albums at the time, giving their 3 main Virgin albums a 20 plus track running order if all environments were made separate, although the inclusion of these in the tracklist still makes both 2016 albums feel a little bit more difficult to comprehend. You can also go the other way, appending the environments to existing tracks, resulting in a fairly conventional looking 15-track album for both of them. 6.5 is more varied than 6, with not only a handful of more Amorphous-esque tracks, but the dubby Something Approaching Happiness, the jazzy Bright Skies, and a number of bleepy electronic IDM style tracks like its partner album. The highlight is undoubtedly Hollow Earth, a 6-minute epic, which builds to a climax of complex percussion and ominous synths, and would fit comfortably on the band's 90s albums. Unlike on 6, there's no obvious atmosphere here, with a generally natural feel, but nothing in the way of absorbing world building. At the same time, on a track-by-track basis, it's arguably the group's strongest record since the 1990s, with the non-environment tracks all being hugely memorable and striking. There are a few silences on the album, which feel very slightly odd, even accounting for the vinyl flip in the middle. Speaking of vinyl, as with Environment 6, a handful of tracks are omitted from the LP version, allowing for a more dynamic mix on the format. This time, however, there's no shaking up of the running order, with the final edition simply lacking the last 5 tracks. The cover's unusual in that it includes the Herd Killing Curves and EBV logos, usually saved for booklets, discs and back covers, on the front itself. This feels like it's leaning into the more collage approach which had begun to be developed over recent books. The cover itself features a rocky seashore, manipulated by Brian in Maya 3D into new shapes, reflecting Boogie's original photos. The CD booklet continues with the theme, with a 3D globular shape over sea photography, bridges and buildings warped in a similar manner, and under the disc the sage and tree line photograph from the archived 8-tray inlay, with a different colour gradient and the splatter logo. The CD and LP discs feature identical designs to the ones on Environment 6, with linked squares on the CD and blurred imagery on the vinyl labels. The now usual Herd Killing Curves and EBV logos feature on the back cover and in the booklet, and the credits once again reference EMS Instruments, Skyflow projects, and art by both Yage and Boogie. Frustratingly, the tracklist appears in 2 columns, the left one squeezed so much that it looks like it's a different font. In many ways, Environment 6.5, with its more overtly amorphous live instrumentation approach, feels like the obvious follow-up to Environment 5, with 6 picking up on 6.5's more electronic side. But then when have FSOL ever done things the logical way? That's certainly how I would recommend listening to them if one is trying to get a broad overview of the group's continuing evolution and story. 6.5 feels more like a natural follow-up to Life in Moments and a precursor to 6. Still, while previous volumes in the series have all had a very obvious theme or atmosphere, 6.5 feels a little loose, a little more vague, and less overtly atmospheric. Were I to place a particular mood on the album, I'd say it's coastal, perhaps inspired by the cover and the title of Harbour somewhat, but also the largely vast open sound of many of the tracks. Still, by those FSOL standards, it's maybe a touch lacking, but it has a huge number of exceptional pieces of music that makes it hard to dismiss in any other way. Indeed, this was the first album I saw regularly referred to as a return to form for fans of the 90s material. Axis of Rotation. By far the strangest album opener in FSOL history, Axis of Rotation is basically an intro to Solid Earth, utilising the same synths. However, it's the jaunty bleeping sounds that are the strangest part. FSOL albums normally begin with some atmospheric elements, but here it's almost like some kind of surreal circus music. Utterly strange. One thing it does well is highlight from the start that this is a very different album to Environment 6. Solid Earth. Continuing the very different vibe to the claustrophobic sounding Environment 6, Solid Earth is FSOL at its most epic, with big dramatic synth chords, loud tablas hard-panned left, and near the end a few vocal snippets. The relatively acoustic sounding drums and ethnic hints given by the tablas make it feel vast and exotic, fitting the title perfectly in the process. However, the programmed drum element does feel a little bit simplistic. Anacro rhythm. Anacro rhythm begins with piano and acoustic guitar before an unidentified plucked string instrument and violin melodies come in. Electric guitar chords and live drums join the mix, and things are very much on the amorphous leaning end of FSOL again. Feels like a cousin of Murmurations and Riders on the Circadian Rhythm, with this blend of live and electronic instrumentation. The plucked catchy melody disappears briefly around halfway through to allow for bright synths to come through, joined by synth bass in the track's outro. A jaunty, uplifting and energetic track, but maybe one not containing much in the way of atmosphere. Some degree of Sanctuary. After a more acoustic, amorphous leaning opening run of tracks, Some Degree of Sanctuary brings Environment 6.5 back to more obviously electronic territory. Other than guitar and piano notes first heard on Sediment, it's all synth washes, glitches and sequences, although its largely formless ambient nature makes it feel a little bit like an outer environment to Anacro rhythm. Opal Light. Bearing some similarity to the IDM leaning tracks on Environment 6, Opal Light takes 6.5 into darker, more electronic realms. It's a very gloomy piece, apparently inspired by The Cure's 1981 album Faith, and very fitting with that record's mood. As well as these synth sequences and chords, and minimal punchy beats, the track features what sounds like saxophone notes played occasionally and adding an incredibly haunting feel to proceedings. The mix is very different to usual FSOL sound, with heavy compression and clearly audible tape hiss. In my initial track by track on the FSOL board, I described it as a thick slab of sound, which works pretty well. Something Approaching Happiness. Brightening the mood of Environment 6.5 a little after the gloomy Opal Light, with its dubby electric bass, Something Approaching Happiness is bouncy and uplifting with layers of backwards guitar, mellow synth pads and Hammond organs. It's another track that would probably fit in well on an amorphous record, but suits this 2010's incarnation of FSOL well too. The drums are similar in sound to those on Solid Earth, bringing a certain amount of consistency to the record, but once again feeling slightly underdeveloped and simplistic, especially in comparison to a lot of the more complex IDM leaning tracks found throughout these two partner albums. Dark Seed. Suddenly doubling the pace after the placid, dubby Something Approaching Happiness, Dark Seed is back into IDM territory again with frenetic drum machine rhythms and quickly changing digital piano chords. As the track grows, more elements appear, including synth strings, growling bass, lively sequences and pads. It appears to end abruptly, leading into what feels like the track's closing environment in the next index on the record. Tunnel North 5. On any other FSOL album, this would very much have been the outro to Dark Seed, sharing the same tempo and key. Tunnel North 5 features a bass sequence first heard 3 years prior on the similarly named amorphous track Tunnel Sequence from the Cartel Volume 2. Over this sequence are several field recordings. Birdsong can be heard, as can a barking dog, splashing water and buzzing crickets. Gradually, whispered voices and gurgling synths take over and fade into the next track. Hollow Earth. Hollow Earth was first heard in incomplete form as outro music to the third A Tiny Point of Light video posted on the Electronic Brain YouTube in 2007. Gaz even replied on that account explaining the track title back in the day. After a while it seemed that it might never appear, so it was with great joy that it eventually turned up on Environment 6.5. A proper slice of FSOL's epic side, it opens with layers of synth sequences over which harpsichord melodies and chords begin to take over. Combined with choral synths, there's something of a baroque historical feel to the track. The piece keeps you on the edge of your seat, growing almost imperceptibly over its first half, before the main riff comes in, then at 3:37 finally the drums. Starting as a fairly simple rhythm, the beat becomes quickly more complex with drum fills, pounding toms and congas, cymbal smashes and other percussion all added, until it becomes a huge tribal beast of a track. And then as easily as they arrive, the drums disappear again, leaving an even more dramatic outro featuring what sounds like a mandolin melody. Eventually the piece closes on harp notes and eventually silence. For vinyl listeners, it's a wonderful way to end the album's first side, and all round this has got to be one of the band's all-time classics. I Dream in Viral Blue. The second half of Environment 6.5 opens with the glorious I Dream in Viral Blue, a jazzy track with rich brushed drums, reversed piano and huge string melodies. These more acoustic elements are filled out with electronic arpeggios and thick synth bass. The frenetic track keeps its high energy up for the most part, eventually winding down over its final minute to close on piano notes and much darker synth chords. Unusually, it fades out to silence. This Place. Continuing the largely warm, uplifting vibe of the album, This Place fades in from silence with layers of electric guitar fed through effects units and sounding a little like Fribbertronics, not dissimilar to Multiples from Environment 5. The guitars are later joined by what sounds like a bagpipe of some kind. The modal melodies played give the piece a very traditional folky sound, which is not something one normally expects from FSOL and makes the short interludes stand out significantly. Ain't Gonna Lie. Thin, trebly synth arpeggios here as Environment 6.5 heads back into more overtly electronic territory again. Deep bass and staggered drums provide rhythm, and as with a lot of the album, it's a very heavy, chunky sound, as opposed to the lighter, clickier feel of the IDM-ish tracks on Environment 6. Flute notes also appear, adding variety to the otherwise purely electronic sound. Light arpeggios, both on synths and a xylophone-like instrument, some string sounds and flute notes. This brief piece feels very much like an outro environment to Ain't Gonna Lie, and on a more conventionally structured album might well have turned up as one. Amplification of Intelligence. Fairly abstract ambient piece, but much longer than a simple intro or outro environment, as many of these on the album are. Birdsong, bells and synth drones open it, with mumbled voices in the background. The darkness quickly fades, however, with chiming acoustic guitar notes, synth pads, backwards electric guitars, piano notes from I Dream in Viral Blue, and the occasional flute. The Day the Poles Shifted. A darker, more menacing and even more epic take on Solid Earth, featuring the same basic drum beat and synth chords, but with richer elements replaced by ominous background synths, reverse guitars and proggy flutes. Once again, a very grand epic vibe exists here, matching the scope of the track's title. Somewhere Near. A brief environment of reverse sounds and synth gurgles that effectively feels like an outro to The Day the Poles Shifted. The frogs and synth sweeps at the end are staples of the Environment series, previously appearing on Environments Part 1, Factories and Assembly, and The Silent Place. Halia Duel. Environment 6.5 heading back to IDM territory here with a crunchy beat that alternates between mid-tempo and super fast and repetitive synth arpeggios. Despite still being minor key, the melodic elements feel much brighter and more uplifting than many of these tracks, fitting in with the overall warmer mood of the album. Gradual but not continuous. An almost sentimental melody on this one, which is quite unusual. When I first listened to Environment 6 and 6.5, I was a bit baffled by the enormous crossover in styles over the two albums, finding a lot of these bleepy IDM tracks interchangeable. But listening back later, it becomes clear that they were picked for the mood. The darker, more melancholic and ominous pieces, and those with particularly skittish sounding rhythms, ended up on 6. While tracks like this, with more bittersweet harmonic content, breakbeat elements, and sampled acoustic notes, are at home with the more acoustic leaning amorphous-ish elements of 6.5. A very lovely, sweet little track. The title comes from some notes Brian's father had made for a presentation at Scottish Television regarding the introduction of computer systems. What would no doubt have been a closing environment to the previous track, where Environment 6.5 structured like a more conventional album, Magnox is one of the most atmospheric environments on the album, with ominous flute notes, gurgling water-filled recordings and dark string samples. The final 30 seconds introduces electronic glitches that build up and lead into the next track. The title really feels like something from an 80s Doctor Who story. Emissions of Light. Another punchy, chunky, heavily compressed track for 6.5 here. A big synth stab opens the track, threatening to suddenly head into stadium EDM territory. It doesn't, thankfully. It's a very subtle piece, without the bigger evocative melodies of the album's other purely electronic tracks. Instead, the focus is on quietly shifting synth pads in the background and layers of glitchy textures of the insectile beat. More minimal than one would normally expect from FSOL. Harbour. Some field recordings, maybe of a harbour, a few water sounds and some synth sweeps. Basically a short outro to Emissions of Light. Bright Skies. Live, jazzy drums, maybe that street drummer again? Occasionally mangled, chopped and sent through pitch shifting effects with melancholic piano notes and beautiful synth chords on top. It's a brief track that I wish was much longer, as it has so much potential for further development. It eventually fades out at 2 minutes to silence. Strange Allure. Environment 6.5 ends on the heartbreaking Strange Allure, a wash of melancholic synth chords and sounds that calls to mind feelings of loss and loneliness. It's an interesting way to close the record after a long run of warmer and largely more welcoming pieces. In the same way, the brighter Solace feels quite different after the rest of Environment 6, but it does very much feel like a final track. After many years of ending records on bizarrely anticlimactic notes, by this point FSOL seemed to have mastered the art of the album closer. The future sound of London, Environment 6+. As with the release of the Cartel Volume 1 and 2 3 years before, the related Environment 6 and Environment 6.5 were also released as a limited edition double CD pack in a slipcase. Each side of the case features one of the two covers, with the lower spine referring to the double set as E6+, just to annoy anybody even vaguely attempting to piece together a consistent naming policy at this point. The upper spine shows the herd killing, curves and EBV logos, as well as new emblems featuring a hexagon and 4 pairs of globules. The CDs line up nicely with matching spines other than the all caps of Environment 6.5. While the two Cartel albums are very clearly linked with alternate mixes of tracks over the 2 volumes, and one being broadly more electronic than the other, these 2 parts of the Environment 6 series are intended to be different albums, making the pairing more of a commercial release than an artistic one. Nevertheless, it's nice to have the 2 related records together, especially with new idents appearing on the artwork. Vinyl fans were offered an E6 Plus package, including both LPs, albeit packaged without a slipcase. And on that, we've come to the end of this rather lengthy video. Do let me know what you think of these albums down below. I think these are a bit of a turning point in the FSOL story, and certainly a point where a lot of fans returned after years away, not enjoying the more acoustic focused sound. So drop me a line below, I'd love reading your comments. There's also like, subscribe and share buttons that you might like to press if you want to help my channel, especially the like button. I'll be back next week with some more unconventional releases, looking at the start of a new album series. Please join me for that. Brian described it to me as being much more, good start. After a long trawl through a dark forest environment, this is the point where the normality of After a long trawl through a long get your words right. The trip through the wood has been taken to